All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. I'm glad you all could make it. My name's Jenna Judge. If you haven't met me, I'm the NOAA Sentinel Site Coordinator for the San Francisco Bay and Outer Coast. And I'm actually going to have Melissa Rosa, our West Coast Geospatial Coordinator, come up to introduce herself briefly and then introduce us. And I don't know if we need to cover any logistics, but there's bathrooms. You'll just have to get a pass from the front desk if you're not familiar speaking.
Cool. Thanks, Jenna. As Jenna said, I'm Melissa Rosa, West Coast Geospatial Coordinator for NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. My position is housed within the Geospatial Solutions Division, but I sit out here in Oakland with the NOAA staff here, so Becky Smythe and the whole gang. Today, though, I'm pleased to introduce Doug Marcy, who came out here for our coastal inundation mapping course the past 2 days over at Tiburon. We wanted to take advantage of his time here in the Bay Area to come speak with you guys about the sea level rise viewer. I imagine a lot of you have used it before or know about it. So he's going to be talking about some updates to the viewer as well as other hot topics around sea level rise in the Bay Area.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Melissa.
Yep.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks for having me. Good morning. I feel like I'm going to be preaching to the choir a little bit here, eventually. But hopefully I will be able to kind of give you some, I guess, cheat sheet kind of stuff for our NOAA Tech Report that came out in January, kind of updating the latest in sea level rise science and scenarios, and talk a little bit about scenarios versus probabilities, and then show you how we're kind of incorporating that into some of the agency tools like our sea level rise viewer and the Corps of Engineers sea level rise calculator. So yeah, I'm at our home office in Charleston, South Carolina. Been with NOAA for about 15 years, and I've worked on everything from riverine flooding. When I first came to NOAA, I was working with the Weather Service. Before that, I was with the Corps of Engineers. Worked on storm surge. We work a lot with the Hurricane Center on storm surge mapping and things like that. And lately, it's been all about sea level rise. Well, not so much lately. Again, preaching to the choir, right? Okay. People actually sitting in the front row is going to accuse you guys of kind of being conservative about your word about the sea level rise getting used. So, all right, so a little bit of, I'm stealing some graphics from the last National Climate Assessment. The current one, NCA 4, is going on now. You're probably aware of the Climate Science Special Report is actually out for approval by the White House. We haven't heard anything about that, but also the chapters are being circulated now through the interagency review process, the federal agency review process. So there are updates to some of these graphs. So these are a little bit old if you're wondering why we don't have more information. So we all know this, right? Increasing CO2 is causing increase in temperature. Temperature is really what's driving all of this. Temperature is really what's driving sea level to change. So we know that's what's happened in the past. We're up now over 400 parts per million. We're up in uncharted territory. We haven't seen that amount of sea level rise. I mean, that much CO2 in the atmosphere since about 600 million years ago. So what's going to happen in the future? And I'm going to try to explain some of the assumptions that go into the climate models. And this is going to relate to some of the probabilities in the scenarios we're going to talk about a little bit later. So you got to keep these RCPs in mind, okay? So representative concentration pathways. Well, here we are right now. I think you guys all know this. 8.5 is essentially business as usual scenario. 2.6 is very optimistic, and then 4.5 somewhere in the middle. So you have this kind of range of likely outcomes. But keep in mind, these are scenarios themselves. They're future outcomes based on a set of assumptions.
Oh. You just unshared the screen.
How do I do that?
There, the mouse was clicked.
Oh, geez.
It was over here. There we go.
Okay, sorry. I didn't try. Anybody read that okay? So I'll leave the slides here, but essentially this tells you all the assumptions that go into each of the RCPs. So they are scenarios, okay? So if you're going to pick this, but if you put them together, you can kind of develop some probabilities based on those. But you got to keep in mind that they are based on, the RCPs are themselves scenarios based on a future outcome on these assumptions. So we all know this, right? What causes sea level to change? What we've seen mostly up to date at this point is the expansion of the ocean. If you warm water, the molecules get farther apart, and so the ocean expands. There's nowhere else to go, so it goes up over land, but we're also adding ice melt. It's not the ice that's floating, it's the ice that's over land. The ice that's floating isn't going to displace any more water. That's why when that big ice sheet broke off the sides of Delaware and the Antarctic didn't change sea level too much, although there was enough water in that ice sheet to fill Lake Erie twice. Some trillion number of gallons is pretty crazy. So that is, all this stuff basically helps with causing sea level to change. And of course, locally what's going on with subsidence makes a big difference, and also the oceanographic changes like Pacific Decadal Oscillation out here and El Nino. So what's happened in the past, okay? So NOAA has been measuring, and other places around the world as well, we've been measuring sea level and water level changes going back into the late 1800s, probably. This San Francisco gauge is the oldest gauge we have in this country. It's 167 years of data. Before that, we used historical proxies based on mostly sediment cores. And then in 1993, we started using satellites, so we can have both gauge data and satellites to compare. And the question is, where are we going to be in the future, right? So this is based on NCA3. This is based on some assumptions I'll talk about in a minute, but it was 0.66 feet to 6.6 feet. Big range, right? But in NCA3, they did call out at the last minute and say, okay, we do have a better idea that it might be between 1 and 4. The climate scientists wanted the scenario folks to pin it down a little bit because they were concerned about the range being so big. So there's a little bit of a probability that was in there. I don't know if you guys even realized that, but there was a range that more likely between 1 and 4 for NCA3. How did they come up with that? They did basically an expert elicitation. It was a subgroup to NCA3 led by Adam Paris at NOAA. And Adam used to work for BCDC, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So he's not with NOAA anymore. He's actually the Jamaica Bay Research group, I think. So they basically, there was a team of folks that looked at all of the literature and all the projections, some empirically based, some statistically based, and some based on climate outcomes or climate models. And these are the IPCC estimates that didn't take into account ice melt, and then you have everything else, some of the names you hear, Vermeer, Romsdorf, Pfeiffer, and then basically came up with this report. It came out in 2002. It's called Paris et al. 2012. I said 2012. But it's also kind of been called the NOAA scenarios, and these are what went into the NCA3. I got a little bit of a zoom in on this. And they were based on, essentially, there were 4 scenarios. One was just a simple extrapolation of the current trend. So this basically says what's happened in the past is going to continue to happen. This is the North Carolina example, because North Carolina won't let you go above even looking at that. Because they actually had a legislative action about that. Anyway, the intermediate low was based on only ocean warming. Intermediate high was based on a moderate amount of ice melt, and then major ice melt, 2 meters was the highest scenario. So there's 4 scenarios, but none of them were more likely than another. If you read that report, they didn't call it any kind of probabilities back then. How are we tracking based on those? Okay, so we can look at satellite altimetry. This is global. Okay, so you can see we're tracking somewhere globally between the intermediate high and the intermediate low. But locally, you can see this variability. It's not going to be a straight curve as we go out into the future. It's going to go all over the place. We're going to have PDO, we're going to have El Nino, but you can see in the last about 10 years, we have this little spike on the southern west coast. Oops, good Lord. So looking at California, this is a great graphic. This came out of your Rising IPCC's report, and you can see we're all over the place. Or maybe we're learning that we're not actually reducing the uncertainty, are we? It's actually getting more uncertain. So what we learn about, and I went to a sea level rise conference up in New York City with all the experts about a month ago. What we can't pin down is the tail of the distribution. We know the middle pretty well. We can do the mean, but the tail is we chase the tail, we call it, because we really want to know what is that upper range, and we just don't know it very well. So you see the NOAA 2017 report, it's a big range still. But practitioners want a much narrower band than that, right? So what's the way to handle that? Well, I'll tell you how to handle it. The greatest source of that uncertainty is what are these guys going to do? What is Greenland going to do? What is Antarctica going to do? We don't really know. Why don't we know? Well, the ice sheets were stable. We didn't study them because they were there and they didn't, they weren't changing. So now they are, and they're hard places to get to, or they're cold. And so every summer now they're coming back with more information. There's a lot more people. I bet you there's a lot more people getting degrees in glaciology now. And so we've basically looked at what we've seen so far is basically increasing the temperature of the ocean plus some ice melt is what's caused sea level to this date. And you can see a lot of that has to do with expansion, a little bit from Greenland, not so much from Antarctica. But right at the end when NCA3 came out in 2014, if you remember, about 2 weeks later or a week later, NASA started putting out information about the West Antarctica ice shelf and the grounding line, and the fact that if we lose that shelf, there's nothing going to stop the Thwaites Glacier and those other ones to accelerate. So the upper end, the tail, just kind of started going even farther up. So enter the new report. This is a report that came out in January. How many have read this? It's a nice light read, huh? It's rough. Even the tables on here. So this is the report. This is just a little history on this. So I'm part of a task force led by several different agencies. NOAA is a co-lead, as well as EPA, Chris Weaver and Billy Sweet. So, and we pulled in like Bob Cobb, and we had a group that basically looked at the current scenarios, the Paris et al., and then basically an update based on some work that was done by DoD. A guy named John Hall, who led a study looking at all the military installations around the world and the vulnerability to sea level rise. So if we go to look in and zoom in here, so here's the 2100 number that we're always looking for, but this report does go out to 2200, okay? And then it gives you your rates. So essentially it gives you 6 scenarios. I'll describe this a little bit better as we go. Come on. So here is the scenarios. So here we have our historical record, right? These scenarios start in 2000. The NCA3 scenario started in 1992. Anybody know why? 1992 was the midpoint of the tidal epoch. You know what a tidal epoch is? Tidal epoch, National Tidal Datum Epoch. It's a 19-year period where the moon goes through a cycle of different distances to the Earth. So it changes the tide over a 19-year period, and it's pretty static. It happens every 19 years. The reason we have tide gauges initially is to set the actual tide datum. So after you monitor the water level over 19 years, you can run all that data through and come up with these statistics, determine what's mean high or high, mean low, and all the different tidal datums. So that's what's done, and so when the epoch is over, then you can use the data. But if you're in the next epoch, you can't really use the data, right? Because you're currently in that epoch. So we're now using the data from epoch 1983 to 2001. So 1992 was the middle of that. That's why they started there. This got moved up to 2000. So they did a little bit farther out and try to update this so it's a little bit more clear because we've already seen a lot of sea level rise since 1992. And this report also looked at probabilities. And this is the first time they really tried to nail down probability of exceedance of these certain values. So you remember the RCPs I was talking to you about? Well, here they are, okay? And so what they did with these scenarios is try to take even slices through the distribution. Think of this as a bell curve, right? Even slices through the curve, right? So your upper end up here is where that tail is. Very low probability, but super bad consequences, right? Low probability here, not so much bad consequences. So maybe we don't really even want to look at this. So if you kind of narrow it down and you look at the probabilities, I drew a red box around where do we think the more likely range is, just like NCA3, that 1 to 4 is in this range, intermediate low to intermediate high, somewhere in there. But it's like your H is up here. You can't ignore that because we don't really know how bad could it get. NCA4 is trying to concentrate also on how bad could it get. They want to put that in there. Yes, this is more certain, but it could be really bad. We just don't know, right? Okay, so let's compare. Here's the new scenarios. Here is the 1 to 4 NCA3 more likely range, and this is from that report of Paris et al. So you can see kind of moved up, or sort of moving this distribution a little bit this way, right? Plus the upper end went from 2 meters to 2.5 meters globally. Oops, sorry. Okay, a little bit about probabilistic, deterministic, and plausible scenarios. Plausible scenarios, really what the RCPs are is, you know, what is going to happen under this certain set of circumstances. If you're doing planning, there's a couple ways you can do it. If you pick one curve and say, okay, give me one number. All the engineers want one number. But if you pick this number, okay, you could be off by this much, you could be off by that much, and there's consequences if you're off by that much, right? So when you design bridges, if you're a structural engineer, you put in a factor of safety, right? So think about it this way. Flood insurance rate map's a 1% chance, right? Now, if you did that for a bridge, if you told someone 1 out of 100 trucks would fall through the bridge, would that be acceptable? No. So they designed that and they put a factor of safety of 2, sometimes 3. So if you're picking one number and you know your tail is kind of uncertain, you kind of want to have more than one option. So choosing multiple scenarios. Lower scenario for less risk, lower risk tolerance, higher risk tolerance, and higher scenario for lower risk. Kind of makes your brain go, wait, high, low, yeah. So, but you can also kind of figure out, okay, well, multiple scenarios, but what about which are more likely? And that's this range here. We can say it's more likely here, so maybe we can do our future planning. And you notice that it spreads as you get farther out into the future. But maybe you want to choose somewhere in the top and bottom, and then also a worst case, which is kind of what you guys are doing with the Rising Seas report, it seems like. So this is just another way to show this. Here's your RCPs. They all kind of have a bell curve. They kind of overlap in here, right? So there's your higher probability. Your range is here, but you see these tails go way up here. So where are you gonna pick on the distribution? And again, it comes into what do you have to lose? And a lot of the reason, like the Corps of Engineers has an issue with the probabilities is that they're having to plan for projects that have to last a long time and significant amount of investment. So you don't want to be wrong. You want to be able to design something that's going to be around 100 years, let's say 70, 100 years. So you have to build it up in this range. You have to take into account a higher sea level rise amount, right? Because it can't fail. It's like the bridge situation. You have to build it. You cannot fail. Another idea here about scenarios is picking one, okay? Here's one of the curves. It's going to do this. It's not going to be a straight line, or not straight line, but a quadratic. It's going to do a lot of this. And this comes from that Hall report I was talking about. The idea is you would go through different phases based on the time. What are you building? Okay, what do you want it to, how long do you want it to last? All the curves are kind of closer together here, so maybe you should have a plan for the first part of the curve, maybe a different plan, phase 2, and a phased approach for construction and things like that into the future. And then zooming in on even closer, because people want to know what about the next 30 years? You know, even then, there is some uncertainty in there, but you can use the risk tolerance to figure out, okay, maybe 2 meters, like maybe 3 feet to 1.5 feet or something like that as a guidance. Okay, going back to the report. It's the first time the Paris et al. Scenarios for NCA3 were only global scenarios. So you still had to go in and look at the tide gauge and figure out what your vertical land motion was to get it to make it local, right? So the sea level's not rising at the same rate in California as it is on the East Coast. East Coast has been a little bit of a hot spot. A lot of that has to do with some of the oceanographic things like the Gulf Stream, and out here it's been due to most of the water's been pushed over to the Western Pacific, and you guys have been okay, but now it's kind of coming back, right? You saw that it started to go up in the last 10 years. This report takes into account, this is using some of the work of Bob Kopp, the oceanographic factors, the gravity changes of melting land-based ice, and vertical land motion. So we did this before when we knew global and then make it local, but these are new. So gravity changes, and this is kind of hard for people to grasp, but when the ice sheets melt, they're going to lose mass. The mass goes into the ocean, but it's going to change the gravity field, or how the water sits on the planet. So farther away from the ice sheet you are, your sea levels are going to go up more. If you're next to the ice sheet, it's going to be lower. It's kind of counterintuitive, but that's how it works. So the ice sheets are actually holding more water close to them now, and as they reduce, the water's going to go other places. Right? So that's going to be added, and so all that gets added into these scenarios. And so what they have in this report is discrete values at each of the tide gauges, yes, but also a grid. So these are 1 degree grid cells. We just took this into GIS and made a grid out of it. But the idea is anywhere in between gauges was always a hard thing. Oh, well, which gauge do I use? Well, you can get a value there now. It's a grid. Okay. So if you go to the NOAA Tech report, you can actually download the CSV file. You know what a CSV file is? It's a spreadsheet. Big honking spreadsheet of a lot of data. We're working with co-ops to try to put out something a little bit more user-friendly and then like a GIS grid that folks could use. Anybody use VDatum? You guys should have taken our class, man. VDatum also has a gridded title surface. That's the reason. Okay. Previous curves. I'm zooming in here now to San Francisco, so I'm trying to make this local. These are the NOAA scenarios out of NCA3, Paris et al. The more likely range, 1 to 4 feet. Okay, and there's the corresponding numbers. These are the new scenarios. Okay, this is the more likely range, intermediate low to intermediate high. Okay, all 6 of the scenarios. This is your H++. So you can get it down to, and this is a great tool, by the way, the Corps of Engineers Sea Level Rise Calculator. You guys ever use that? Just Google USACE Sea Level Rise Calculator. You can go in and put in you choose your location, and it boils it down to a curve for your spot and all the numbers. All right, trying to make this even more fancy graphics. So this is NCA3 for San Francisco, okay? Here's the more likely range we had back then, 1 to 4. Now, just to kind of illustrate this, I've given you a box, and this is an example of Charleston, South Carolina, where I live. They developed a sea level rise strategy, and they determined that they want to start for low risk tolerance, 2.5 feet. It's kind of like freeboard, and then 1.5 foot. So for open spaces and things that are not, it's okay if it floods, maybe 1.5 feet and then 2.5 feet. So they drew a box. And they did it out to 50 years from the present, and it's a sliding thing. They'll have to reevaluate every 10 years. So they're not planning out to 2100. They're doing here, and the curves are closer together. But just keep an eye on the box. Okay, these are the new scenarios, right? Here's the more likely range. So they planned initially using the old scenarios. Well, the whole thing did this. So we're actually encouraging them now to go to potentially up to 3 feet. And 2 feet as their range instead of 1.5, 2.5, and 1.5. So, and that is again because the whole tail, the whole distribution has shifted a little bit. How are we tracking versus the new scenario? So, using satellite altimetry tracks, which are these little things, and then the gauges, you can look at the 6 scenarios, and this is for the southern Pacific coast. You can see how we're tracking. So right now, looks like we went up above the intermediate scenario, and we're kind of hanging around, but that's that last 10 years or so, or less, we've seen an increase out here. And the north. The north is not so bad because of the tectonic uplift. You know this, North Cape Mendocino. You've got a whole different tectonic thing going on, so the land is actually not, it's actually keeping up with sea level, so you've not seen the sea level rise as much there. Okay. How is this being made real to people? And this is what we've been focusing on more in NOAA, is the canary in the mine scenario, which is high tide flooding. We used to call it nuisance flooding, and you've probably seen Billy's papers, Billy Sweet. We're actually changing the terminology because nuisance, people are saying it's more than a nuisance, right? At this point, like Miami's like, this is bad, not just a nuisance. So nuisance to me is like a fly. So this is more like, okay, this is happening, it's very chronic, and so we need to start looking at it. But you guys know this, if you study any kind of oceanography basics in college or high school, we have the perigean spring tide. Spring tide doesn't just happen in the spring. Spring means it's springing up, right? People always get that confused. But the scientific name is perigee, and it's when the moon is closer to the Earth. And in the in the springtime, it's usually for a new moon, and in the fall, it's a full moon. But it affects the tides, and when the moon's closer, we get bigger tides. And what we're seeing is, this is an example in Norfolk, Virginia, is back in the 60s, the number of times we're starting to get these water levels exceeding a certain thresholds, and we're using some thresholds set by the Weather Service. When it goes over a certain height, they issue flood warnings because things start to flood, and causes some issues. And you can see the whole distribution is shifting. So what used to be every once in a while is becoming, when flooding begins, is becoming a lot more often. It's called non-stationarity. You guys know what that is? So we can no longer plan on the past data, right? This is the problem with the FEMA maps. They do not take into account non-stationarity. We're starting to get to the point where the last 100 years does not reflect what the next 100 years is going to be because the whole distribution is moving. So what was the 1% chance in the 50s is not anymore. It's probably like the 100 year is probably now the 75 year. So San Francisco, La Jolla, these are the number of observed times we've gone above these thresholds, and this is kind of blown up. So these little bars are blown up here for you, okay? Future emission scenario, this is where we're going to get to. It's going to happen, it's going to start happening at the upper end of the scenarios, like the H++, it's going to happen every tide. I couldn't separate these two graphics very well, so I just have Charleston, East Coast example, San Francisco. There's a little bit of difference, but you get the same picture, right? We're going to get to the point where high tide flooding is happening every day. Top 10 areas that with increased high tide flooding: California, San Francisco, 364% increase. And I pulled out these two tipping points. When are we going to see greater than 30 days of nuisance flooding, high tide flooding, by 2030, 2040? Embarcadero, right? What are storms going to do? We don't really know. Future storminess is a hard thing to figure out. These are hurricanes. You guys don't get hurricanes, but you get the idea. Will the future affect storm tracks? Climate change will affect storm tracks, waves? We don't really know. That's a really hard thing to figure out. What we do know is sea level is going to make any of those storms worse because you're basically just raising the whole system up, so waves will be able to propagate farther inland. So what used to be the 2010 floodplain by 2100 will be much farther in, right? So if you're going to do future conditions mapping, you pretty much want to map, okay, we know it's here now. Where is it going to be? Maybe we shouldn't build there. And this affects a lot of people. You guys are, congratulations, you're in the higher category of what a number of people that are going to be impacted by that. And you affect the economy of the whole country. I have another graphic of Louisiana, and it goes this way, but I love this graphic. Right? It's a coastal nation, even if you live in the middle of the coast, because you're getting goods that come in through our ports. So if the ports don't operate, we're screwed.
Wait, could you explain that?
This is all of the truck traffic, total combined truck flows from LA Long Beach and where they go in the country. And the volume is think of this as arteries and capillaries. So as the trucks come into one port, they're fanning out all over the place. So the idea is if you cut off the heart, it all dies. This is me every day in my office, especially lately, let me tell you. You guys know this part, steps to resilience. This is what we're trying to do. We know the problem, right? We try to map it. We want to identify, determine our vulnerabilities, doing a vulnerability assessment. What we really are trying to do there is figure out how much money, what's going to be the effect on the economy, how much is it going to cost, investigate options to try to fix it. Then it comes down to cost-benefit, risk, cost-benefit. What are we going to sacrifice? What are we going to continue? What are we going to do? Seawalls? Are we going to do gray and green infrastructure? All that has to be taken. But the hardest part is this 5 for local communities. Take action, because this is stuff that's hard to sell if you're a politician, because you may only be in office a couple years. It's hard to say, well, yeah, we're going to make this huge investment for something that's going to happen in 60 years, right? So it's a hard thing to do, but it's actually happening, and it's really neat to see it. Charleston, giving you kind of some East Coast examples. Charleston was filled in. This is the old shoreline. This is the current map. A lot of the coastal cities on the East Coast are like this. Norfolk, they filled in a lot of these areas, and guess where? It floods, where they filled in. So what are they doing? They're putting in huge tunnels to get the water. The issue there is with the high tides and rain at the same time. It was a stormwater system that was designed over 100 years ago. And now when a high tide comes in, there's no gravity. It's a gravity-fed system. So when there's no gravity, or they call it head, if you're an engineer, there's no, the water will not flow. So basically the rain will sit there and can't go anywhere. So the combination of high tide and rain causes a lot of problems. So they're basically getting the water off the street, building these huge tunnels, and they're pumping them out into the surrounding river. And that's basically the New Orleans situation, where sea level will be up here, and we're going to be pumping out the water. Also, rebuilding the seawall, hard. So they've already invested $235 million in Charleston. I just have a couple more examples. You've heard the Miami situation. Miami Beach, the mayor there actually ran on, his whole platform was fixing the flood problems. So they're raising public roads. They're putting in seawalls. They've probably spent $400 to $500 million up to this point. Norfolk is another city. They invited the Dutch to come over. Dutch dialogues discuss possibilities for how's the Norfolk region or the Hampton Roads area going to deal with this. Got a lot of military there. So trying to throw around options and do this kind of vulnerability mapping. Enter our viewer. Any questions up to now?
I had a question about that Army Corps calculator.
Yeah.
You said any location, is that feeding off the grid from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure is.
So you can put somewhere in random place in Northern California that
Yep.
doesn't have tide gauge. Okay.
Yeah, I can show you that in a minute if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, we can just do a little demo. That's what I was going to do. I was going to stop now for questions, and I was just going to give you a little demo of our viewer.
I was curious about when you mentioned they're raising the roads. What kind of timeline are they looking at? Are they raising it to what they think is like?
What criteria? Yeah, how many feet? I'm not exactly sure. I know a lot of what they're doing in Charleston and Miami is only fixing the current issues. Like in Charleston, we're basically just working on the current flood problems and not really looking at how bad is it going to be by 2050 or so. So I do know they're just trying to elevate them so they won't be impacted by flooding now. I don't know how much they're elevating them though. Yeah.
You mentioned the core calculator that can give you local civil rights. Is it using your data here? Are they linked or not?
Yeah. I'll demo that in a second. Yeah.
And then are you talking to people about changing that?
Yes. That's a whole other presentation if you want to.
You want to go back to the previous slide?
Yeah. No, actually, to answer your question, yes. I don't know if you're familiar with legislation. The Biggert Waters 2012 Flood Reform Act gave Congress basically told FEMA to set up a technical mapping advisory council to give them feedback on how to include future conditions into their mapping program. So I actually served as a subject matter expert. NOAA is on that team. It was Juliana Blackwell from NGS. Now it's Tony Lavoie, who's also our geospatial officer, but he also works at our office as the head of the IT group. So we have been there's a future conditions modeling report, there's annual reports, so you can go and Google that stuff. Just do FEMA TMAC, and you can get all the reports. There's plenty of recommendations that have been sent and given to FEMA. They just haven't acted on them yet, mostly due to resource issues. You said previous slide.
Well, it was really just the head on the computer.
Is that a question?
No, it's just in reference to talking to FEMA. It's just like your head on the computer desk.
Oh.
Oh, you like that? Oh, gotcha. Yes, that's right. FEMA's not here, are they? Oh, no. No, we give them a hard time. They know. I know Ed Curtis and Julie Hayes pretty well, so I'm going to sit here and demo. So. Let's see. So you're seeing, all I did was put in use-based sea level rise calculator. I will not claim anything to do with the design of this website, but it's good information. So essentially, here you go with your, you can actually enter your project name. Let's call this California. Select the node tide gauge, and there's a couple things. Now, if you go to the new report, you can go in here and look at different scenarios. That's the Paris et al. NCA3. You can do combined with the Corps of Engineers has their own sets of curves. This is that DOD report, and then the new one, NOAA et al. 2017. All right, so you can zoom in. You can turn on the grid points right here. Oops, it's sending me back out for some reason. You can get information at each one of these points. Those are the actual gauges, and then these yellow things are the grid points. So if you want to know what the sea level rise in Sacramento is, no, it just overlaps. So you can click here. Should be able to. Shoot, let's just do this. Okay, so San Francisco. And there's your curves. We can turn on the interpolated. And there's your curves. And there's your numbers. So anywhere along the coast you can get that. It's the same information, same spreadsheet, honking spreadsheet that we put into our viewer too. So these will match. And we actually work with the Corps of Engineers calculator guys because they're on the Sea Level Rise Task Force with us. So we did this kind of at the same time. So you guys are familiar with our Sea Level Rise viewer? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not going to go over everything that it does because we just kind of recently put out a new version which improved some of the functionality. We did a lot of we got a lot of feedback from our regional staff. We kind of canvassed what would you like to have changed in the viewer based on user feedback. We tried to make a lot of those changes. We couldn't make all of those changes, but we tried. So we kind of redid the formatting. We now allow you to type in your address or your city. So I did it before. I typed in Charleston. I'm so used to doing it. Okay, zoom in. A little slow today. So one thing we did, we just changed and put the vertical slider. So this is very similar to how climate central surging seas. And then, you know, none of this has changed. We left the beginning tab. Basically, we figured that a lot of people come and they never get off that tab, but it's more for the general public and more for kind of awareness. If you really wanted to get into local scenarios, you're probably looking for more technical information. So we kept it on a separate tab because of that. So this is pretty much does the same thing. You know, you got your CanVis images here. You know, so it looks at basically based on the elevation we know there, and when it gets impacted. What's that?
That's
Most of it read about
Yeah, we like for that to be underwater.
The last is
Okay. Well, so I just want to show you the functionality here. So we've added the local scenarios in here, and basically just tells you zoom to your area of interest. Now, right now, it's based on at the tide gauges. We don't have the grid in the viewer yet. We're going to try to get there eventually. We just ran out of time implementing this. The NOAA report didn't come out in time because we were going through the redesign of this, and the report didn't get published till January. It was a little bit of a timing thing, but it really does serve the same purpose, and it doesn't change that much between gauges. So, all right, so we can click on Oakland here. So we'll zoom in. Let's look at the airport. Okay, so this is great because it can be used for critical thresholds. So what we did was we said, okay, how are we going to incorporate this stuff into our viewer the easiest way without having to do all this remapping and stuff? So we still have our 6 feet. We're working on actually mapping up to 10 feet. That'll just get kind of put in here eventually, hopefully in a year. So we still have our 1 foot increments, so that's kind of independent of the scenario. So if you want to look at what's the critical threshold for the airport, it looks like between 4 and 5 feet. Okay, so you can kind of see, okay, between 4 and 5 feet, we're going to have a problem. So if you want to use the scenarios to figure out, okay, when is that going to happen, or under what scenario is it going to happen? Well, if you want to do the NOAA intermediate, okay, well, we won't get to 4 feet by 2100, only 3. Intermediate low, we probably won't get there, but under the high scenario and intermediate, yeah, we will. We probably by 2080 we'll get to 3.48, or sorry, yeah, 3.48. Or you can do it by year. So same thing. Now, so all these start out in 2000, and they're all the same, right? As the curves, all we're doing is basically a different way to visualize those curves spreading apart as you go out, right? So let's do the high scenario, 3.9 feet. So this is what, between there and there, will happen somewhere around 2070, based on that, selecting that scenario, based on that scenario, so the high scenario. So there's different ways to use it, and so what we're just trying to give you the flexibility to choose a scenario, and it just kind of shows you how things will change in the future, the fact that they're all close together, but the uncertainty, and that chasing the tail again. By the time we go up really high, they kind of stack up here because we don't have mapping there yet, but we will be adding more layers in here, and then this will just expand the slider to accommodate that. We also have done this on the Marsh tab this is not a great example because this is very developed, but using our land cover data, our CCAP, sorry guys, this mouse is not cooperating very well. Using our CCAP land cover information, we've tried to show what's going to happen to especially the marsh areas. Will they be able to migrate? If there's high density, low and medium density development, they probably will not be able to migrate. So based on some sort of standard accretion rates, will the marshes be able to come up based on the sedimentation? So will they be able to keep up with sea level rise? If you have 4 millimeters of accretion just means sediment, piling up on top of the marsh and keeping up with sea level. As the sea level goes up, marsh might be able to keep up. And you can see with higher accretion rates, you're sort of buying down your impacts of sea level, kind of more clear at the lower level. So no accretion, going to go up, high accretion, down. And so if you want to look at the high scenario, this 2.5 feet for 2070, this is what the land cover might look like based on that. Okay, so as you change your parameters, 2040, you want to look at the extreme scenario. Oh, that's more like what the marsh would look like, or the land cover under the certain accretion scenarios.
Sorry, where's the legend of what the colors mean?
Right up here. I'm sorry, I didn't have that. This mouse is terrible. I really want to go to that one square. There we go. Okay. Right here. 16 land cover types. So, yeah. And then flood frequency. We already had this in the viewer before. It hadn't really changed that much. We are basically mapping that threshold that Weather Service uses when they start to issue flood warnings, shallow coastal flood warnings. So at this gauge here in San Francisco, the forecast office says that at 1.16 mean high water is when they start to issue flooding. And that's what floods, that's sort of the minor flooding area in red. And we looked at how many times has that happened in the past 5 years, and how many more times is it going to happen. So with a meter of sea level rise, you're looking at having that red area impact about 679 times a year. We're going to try to work more with our sister agency co-ops to, there's going to be a reanalysis of about 121 tide gauges, and they're going to be trying to develop more statistically based thresholds. And if that's the case, we'll use that and come back in and redo this mapping. And then we'll be able to tie in a longer period, because they're doing the analysis from co-ops. We'll be able to pull that in here too. So we go back to like the 60s and see how much more flooding we're seeing than we did back then. So that's really all that's changed. For each of these, we have an information button here. So it tells you about the scenarios, how to view by year, by scenario, and then understanding them. It links to all the reports and the core calculator right there. So, and it tells you that we're using the same methods, so we're on the same page with those guys.
Hey, Mark, how does the Corps use their sea level rise calculator?
They do it, and that's really what it was designed for. It was never really supposed to be a public tool, although a lot of people use it now. It was designed for their districts to use it for planning in the future. They have an engineering circular and an engineering technical letter that says that for the Corps projects they build, they have to take into account sea level rise. So there's a whole flow chart of when they're designing, for instance, a levee or a beach renourishment project or something like that, they have to include sea level rise. So they've built that tool for their engineers to go in there and put in critical thresholds and figure out when are they going to be exceeded. And so based on the design life of the project, they have to meet certain criteria based on that. And they use their own, they had developed their own set of curves, but now they just started putting in these other agency curves in there as well. So their original core curves are still in there, but they've just decided, since a lot of people are using the tool now, to put the other agency curves in there too.
Do they use their curves, or do they use which?
They're all in there.
They're all in there.
Yep.
It's kind of up to them which curve they use.
Yeah. Yep. I thought the NRC scenarios were in here too.
Yeah.
Right, but I thought we could select them. Anyway, I thought you could. I don't know. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does the system account for changes to the shoreline in terms of shoreline protection?
No. No, not this, and our viewer does not either. We have a lot of caveats if you read the disclaimer, if you're so interested and want to. It basically says, right here, here's all of our disclaimer, but basically no. We illustrate the scale of potential flooding, not the exact location, and do not account for erosion, subsidence, or future. We do actually now, I'm going to change that, John. We do account for subsidence now with that in scenarios, but we're really looking at water as they would appear during the highest high tides and excluding wind-driven events. We've left out storm surge, and we did that on purpose because we wanted to keep it simple and usable for folks.
We have a question in the chat too. So how well do these scenarios and the maps and tools based on them account for what we now know is happening with Greenland and Antarctica, even with all the uncertainty?
Okay, that's a good question. That is, kind of feel like I might have addressed that earlier in the presentation, that the upper end of the, like the NOAA extreme and your H++, they're the same, are kind of nodding to the fact that we know that Greenland and Antarctica are starting to change, and we don't know exactly how bad it's going to be. So that was why that was added in to the scenarios, the upper end. Now, one thing you did notice, your H++, and when I read your report, you don't put a probability associated with that one. But in the NOAA report, it is in there as a part of the distribution, so you can actually get the exceedance for that particular scenario. So if you chose to do that, you can point to the report.
And just quickly for everyone on the phone, I'm going to unmute you all, so please remute yourself unless you wish to ask questions. So feel free to ask questions and participate in the discussion. Hopefully this isn't total chaos. Not working.
Sometimes we get a lot of feedback, echoing and stuff.
Do you know how to actually mute people? No. No. Okay, well, or you can just type your questions into the chat and we'll be done.
Mark, how often is the federal government
Doug.
updating
You didn't catch it.
how often is the federal government updating its curves?
Oh, that's a good question. We'll probably evaluate it every time we do a climate assessment. And theoretically, that's every 4 years, but we actually did pretty good between NCA 3 and 4. That's about right. It came out in 2014, and this one will come out in 2018, if it comes out. So that's probably when we'll look at it again. We'll look at the state, because that's the whole point of the climate assessment, is look at the state of the climate. And then the first thing that comes out is the climate science special report, and that's all the new climate science, and that's what drives the assessment. So you look at all that information, and then the assessment is supposed to be, how is that going to impact the country? So that's probably when it'll be done again. And the numbers will probably change, and the tail might even get wider.
Can I ask a question back on the last dimension that you were showing around flooding?
Yeah.
Not quite sure how to ask the question, so.
Where am I? I don't like this thing. Where is it? Go away. I didn't want to do that. Sorry. Well, go ahead and ask the question while I'm doing this.
And so you showed the point in the bay that would be, flooding 600 sometimes a year.
What's wrong? It really isn't me, guys. It's not because I had too much coffee. This mouse is really terrible. Maintain my focus. It knows me. ADD guy. All right. So what was the question?
So, yeah, and again, I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but so it says, over the point you had before was like over 600
Yeah.
incidents a year.
Right.
How are they defining, or how are you defining?
Right. Okay.
The presence of
Yeah.
1 inch of water, a foot of water? I mean, what's the?
No. Okay. Good question. So at that gauge, which is underneath here, the Weather Service has determined, based upon empirical evidence, which means they just kind of go and say, when the water gets to this height at that gauge, we know stuff starts to flood. That's kind of what they do. The forecasters will put out a warning or an advisory. What we can do with the water level data and the database is go back in history and see how many times have we gone above that threshold. Mm-hmm. So it's just a tipping point, okay, and then you count the number of times. So we went back 5 years here only, but so it's not a great statistical. It's a pretty big jump to say 5 years, and then it's going to be that way, but. We use it's called an Inundation Calculator. If you Google coastal inundation yeah, I think it's called Inundation Calculator. You can put in thresholds and figure out how many times have you gone over those thresholds. So you could do that analysis here in the bay if you wanted to. So that's 11 times, right? And then we added up the total amount of time that's been above the threshold, and that's this bar. If you add up the hours, it ends up being a day, 1 day, 24 hours. And then so all we're doing is you keep the threshold the same, but now sea level's gone up, so you're hitting that a lot more times, right? So now you're 316 times you're going to be going above, up and down. But you're still only going to be over the threshold for 36 days. But then when you go up to this point, it's happening almost every tide, and it's most of the time, well, not most of the time, but it's a long part of the time. So the co-ops has a really neat thing called the Inundation Dashboard they're working on, but it's not available out here yet. We're doing it on the East Coast. They're going to try to do the same thing. We'd like to eventually hook into that and not use only 5 years. They have a whole history going back to the 60s, and you'll see bar graphs and showing how, kind of like those the ones I was showing you with the La Jolla and San Francisco, how you know the bars are increasing as you basically keep the threshold the same. Then you just track how many times.
Can I just clarify? So you were saying that's the date. Is that the number of days, like the full number of hours that it's over that, or is it the dates in the year?
It's total number of hours that add up to that number of days.
Hours,
yeah. Yeah. So frequency and duration, we're just trying to capture both aspects of that. Because frequency is one thing, but it could happen 10 times a year, but only for very small portions of time, and that could be maybe tolerable, but then you're going to get to the point where the duration is so long that you can't use the roads anymore or areas. Any other questions? Yeah?
I just want to follow up on the erosion shoreline change. Is that like 3 versions down the road, sort of merging like the Cosmos work USGS is doing? Am I touching on third rail? I don't know. But
no, I mean, that's a good question. I think Cosmos is a great example. There's USGS out of Woods Hole. They've been doing some really good work on, you know, what is going to be the response, the coastal response, and are the beaches going to be able to keep up? What's the bluffs, what are the bluffs going to do? The geomorphology change, which is a very hard thing to model. So there's really good work going on that. This tool, when we first put it out for the West Coast, I mean, we kind of started in the Gulf and then we've expanded it. We've got it everywhere now, pretty much, except for Alaska. But you know, it was about 2012, I think, once it was put out here. So none of that stuff was around. There wasn't a whole lot of models. There was no national effort at that point. So we've kind of kept it simple, but there are a lot of really good. And I know Patrick, and you know, how we describe that is this is a good starting point. And for vulnerability assessments, it's a good. But if you want to look at more of the process and how is storm surge going to be impacted with sea level and what's the future wave climate and all that, then Cosmos would be a better, you know, something to look at. So it just depends on whether you want to just plan for just sea level change or you want to try to start looking more at the process stuff. So, but you know, it just depends. I mean, we're all using the same mapping procedures. So when we do our inundation mapping class, we say this, you know, give us any kind of model output, we'll produce a map, and we'll do it the same way, whether it's a simple bathtub approach or one value versus a really complicated grid. You pretty much map it the same way, and we're all using the same base data. So it's just a matter of, do you want your map to cover more area or not when you're doing your vulnerability assessment? So what do you plan to? In my opinion, you can do an awful lot of process modeling and all that kind of stuff, and it'll tell you the same thing as a bathtub model would, that area is going to be vulnerable. I think people always are waiting for better information. The very first maps that ever were done out here were done in the late 80s, before BCDC started doing them with Tim Doherty putting out the 1 meter. They're done in the 80s by doing them on a topographic map by hand, and they pretty much show the same thing that we're showing now, right? But we keep waiting for better information, but no, it's, yeah.
I work for BCDC, and this map is really great. It's so simple, and I think it's a really great tool for the public. We are working on our creating a regional analysis through the Adapting to Rising Tides program, and we just completed some mapping that includes overtopping and an analysis of the shoreline. And we're not using it, at least as far as I know right now, for regulatory purposes, but we are for planning purposes.
Yeah, in our class yesterday, Chris May came and talked all about that. And just so you guys know, it makes you feel any better, so when they develop the maps, they use our methodology. So they use the same methodology for doing the mapping, and now the analysis on the levees and all that they've done, that's really awesome stuff, you know. So we've actually used that information and we've incorporated it into some areas. We actually fixed the problem in Redwood City. We fixed a couple other places based on that. And what we want to do, we talked about this yesterday, is if you guys will, Eliza and I were talking about it, if you guys will give us the DEM that you're using for those maps, we will go back and update this so that our maps are consistent exactly with your maps.
That's great.
Yeah.
My question was kind of related. It was more of, it's good. I'm happy to hear that you're updating the DEM with fixes we find, but we often find things like in Foster City, Redwood City, and send it to USGS, and they update the topographic data, but they don't rerun the model. They just do like a patch approach. Have you guys been communicating with them so that you can update your DEM with those kind of small fixes, like if we find a tide gauge or something that the LiDAR didn't pick up originally?
I'm not getting that information directly from USGS, no, but if you let us know, and that's kind of how we've done it at other places. There's places in New England where there's a lot of dams up the rivers and stuff that we didn't take into account, and so they let us know, we'll go in and fix it. And so if you find places like that, that's why if you give us DEM you use that have all that stuff in there already, then we could just use that. We would, create a map that looks exactly like yours. So. And another thing, I don't know if this helps, but I know you guys also have, because they're everywhere now, it's the Climate Central Surging Seas application. They use all of our data too, so they're using the same elevation data. We actually provide all of our DEMs to them. So their maps should match ours, and but they map up, higher than we do, but it's at least based on the same elevation data. And for what it's worth, not that it matters for you guys here, we also share all that data with the National Hurricane Center, so all of the storm surge map stuff that's going out is based on the same data too, so it's consistent.
There's another question from the firm. For critical flooding thresholds, is mapping sufficiently granular to address subsurface conduit to water such as culverts, tunnels, or utilities?
Great question. Answer, you guys know the answer to this already. No. If you want to do, urban flooding is probably the most difficult type of flooding to model, right? The FEMA maps don't do it either, right? It's based on riverine flooding. The urban environment is so complicated, so that would require a pipe network analysis and all the culverts. No, we don't do that. We can't get to that level. It would be a good starting point. Now, if you go, I will say, this is another kind of neat, is it going to tell me I'm going to lose my focus again? See the green areas on our viewer? You guys have these in your art maps too, right? Yes? Okay. The green areas are not connected to the ocean, but they're low-lying areas, right? So this is purely based on the DEM, and this is where the pipe network comes in. We don't really know. Probably this is connected here, but at the surface you can't tell that. But if it goes underneath the road because of the culvert, we don't have that information. But you can at least identify these places that are probably going to have urban flooding issues because they are closed basins, so that in other words, it doesn't drain to the water body that sits there, right? The only way it can get out is through a drain system. So if you have high tide and the water can't get out, it's probably going to pond here in those areas. So you can use that as a place to figure out where your flood problems might be. Usually you already know where they are, but.
So. What's the expense inland, say, up the Delta?
Yeah. Did Becky Smythe pay you to ask that question?
I'm not at home.
They've been asking for us to map farther up the Delta for a while, right, John?
Yeah. Not gone there.
Okay. We stop here. I think a lot of things stop here, not just ours. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why. Our V-data model that we use for the mean high water surface doesn't go up that far. We also, the NOAA and USGS DEMs that we used didn't come up here, and this is I think DRC has data up here. The DRC, what's the group that? DWR. I work with too many different states. So, but they're flying this whole region with new LiDAR, I think, or it's out. It should be out. So we could definitely take it farther up. But the problem is where does this become tidal and not tidal? Without some detailed modeling, it's going to be hard to figure that out. But does Cosmos go that far up? They're going to do that?
There's, I think, a separate effort at USGS modeling what's happening in the Delta, including sea level rise and flows. So, but that's what we're trying to figure out, I think.
Well, Canada has the latest update, the extent is further in the Delta. And I think now it goes past any, but I don't.
So another question from the webinar. Do you have plans to incorporate creeks and rivers into the urban modeling problem? Flows coming down the watershed as well as the bay/ocean?
No, we don't have any plans to get into that detail of modeling for this. Now, something like Cosmos, that I think they do take into account riverine flows. More sophisticated modeling would be able to allow you to do that, a hydrodynamic model, but we don't. And, you know, we're doing this at the national scale, so we are trying to imagine trying to map the entire country. We've got this for all the territories too, so it's hard. We try to keep it up to date as we possibly can with new elevation data, but we don't have the resources to get to that level of modeling. All right, anything else?
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Do you want to show this?